Hey guys, so today I'm going to cover the render settings I use for Twitter, Instagram, and lastly YouTube with Sony Vegas. For Twitter and Instagram I use the same render settings always, and for YouTube I actually don't render with Vegas. For YouTube I use After Effects, and I'll show you the process I use for that. First things first, let me turn motion blur off. When I go to render in Vegas, I always right-click this little blue bar and click Render to New Track. I always look for the MAGIX AAC MP4 format because you can't upload AVI files to Instagram. My render settings for Instagram, these are it right here. Sometimes I do this, but usually I just leave it low. I feel like these render settings work best with Instagram because Insta always compresses the living shit out of videos whenever I upload to it. And this has a small enough file size to where Instagram won't actually compress it as hard. I don't know how to describe it other than that. If you want to render it, I use the main concept AVC. You can change it to the NVIDIA encoder if you want. This will probably increase your render time because it uses your graphics card, but it's very buggy. For example, you can't change your frame rate to like 25 or 22, or you can do 25, you can't do 22, you can't do like any non-normal amount for some weird reason. So I just use main concept AVC because I like being able to render in whatever frame rate I want. My square resolution frame size render settings, I just do 1920 by 1920 because this is pretty much 4K. If you upload the file you make from this to YouTube, it'll be in 4K. And you always want to use main profile. Actually not really sure what these other two do, but I've always used main and the video always comes out good looking, so. And then you want to include audio, of course. Your video settings are good. When you go to your project, I always have it on best. If you don't know what use project settings is, it's basically this part right here when you click on the settings right on top of the display. That's where you can set it to full resolution rendering quality, and you can change that to best. Also, copy down my project properties if you're not using disabled resample already. I think you also want to change your field order to none progressive scan. I think this is good instead of best. And this one should be smart resample. Change that to disable resample because you don't want any form of resample. And with deinterlacing, make sure it's set to none. Motion blur type, I'm not sure what this does, but I just leave it at Gaussian. It never does anything really. And the rest of these don't matter. You're pretty much set after you have this. And if you want to change your video resolution for your project, this is also where you'd want to do that. That's how I do MP4 exports with Sony Vegas. When I render AVI for YouTube, I usually just do custom frame size and set it to whatever I have the project set to. Normal, if it's like 1920 by 1080, just double that because YouTube really likes high quality. And then for the frame rate, just do whatever frame rate your project is. You always want to match your project settings when you're rendering from here. But you also, for the video format, you always want to use Lagrith lossless codec if you're rendering in Vegas. Make sure these settings are exactly what you have. Or you can use uncompressed. I use uncompressed when I'm gonna render the final render in After Effects for YouTube, and that's just because all of these do compress the video a little bit. Uncompressed it's gonna be the biggest file size, but it's uncompressed. There's no compression. Compression basically makes the video file size smaller, and you lose quality when you compress. And the interleave I just have it set to 0.250. I'm not actually sure what interleaving does. I haven't done any like experimentation with it, but this always works for me, so yeah. Use uncompressed if you're doing motion graphics and you need an alpha channel, then turn on render alpha channel, but if you're fine, just use this if you're just rendering to After Effects. This part of the tutorial is for if you want to render with After Effects. And I'm gonna show you guys my render setting. I'll just throw them on screen really quick, and then I'll go into where you find all of that if you don't know what you're doing at all and just are new to editing. When I open an After Effects project for upscaling from Sony Vegas to After Effects, I always drag it in. And then I add a few effects to it to make sure the upscale looks really clean on YouTube. Because YouTube really likes sharpen for some reason. I always add a sharpen to the whole composition first. I set the sharpen amount to around 18. You just make sure it says 18 right here. Just type in unsharp mask, and I always use the default values for BCC unsharp mask. If you don't want to use BCC or you don't have BCC, you can use the built-in unsharp mask in After Effects. Crank the radius up, Then that'll basically make your dark spots a little darker and kind of just generally make the whole edit have more contrast to it. It doesn't really mess with the colors or anything. When I'm adding grain, I always have the grain amplitude set to 0.21 on S_film damage, and I turn every other value down to 0. If I'm adding flicker or defocus, this is also the plugin I use to do my passive flickers. And from here, you want to make sure you're in the composition that you want to render. You want to go to File, Export, click on Add to Render Queue, and you want to go to your render settings. You can go to frame rate, use this frame rate and set this to like 60, and then go to the output module. The format options, you can leave it as none, or if you really want to, you could use, I use lag growth lossless codec. X264 VFW is really good too. I just prefer lag growth lossless. The file sizes are small enough to where I can upload them to YouTube easy. Once you have the format that you want to render, you want to click OK, turn on resizing, and you want to just do 3840 by 2160. 3840 by 2160 is 4K. If you're doing it like this, you want to make sure that the lock aspect ratio is turned on and type 3840 in the first one. And you're pretty much set from there. Everything else, nothing else really matters. And honestly, it does a lot. If you're worried about your quality getting lost, render in a really high resolution. Make sure you put sharpen and unsharp mask on, of course, because that'll make YouTube like the video more. YouTube itself will recommend it more. Once you're there and you've done all this, you should be good to go. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, leave a like, leave a comment if you learned anything or if you used these settings, and I'll see you guys in the next one.